Hello, I'm Chrissy Seaton and welcome back to my YouTube channel, My Noahide Family. We're continuing on with the book of Job, and in this particular video we're going to be looking at chapters 18 to 21. And this is actually Bildad's, this is one of Job's friends, Bildad's second speech and Job's response to his speech. So we'll pick up now and continue on with this. So it tells us in the comments that in Bildad's second speech, he seems to ignore the suffering of Job and struggles to make sense of his afflictions. And so Bildad focuses mostly on theoretical description of the fate of a sinner, and he speaks about the certain death of a sinner's children. Bildad seems insensitive to Job's loss of his children, and his focus is on the destruction of sinners, which goes to prove, from his point of view, that there is justice in the world. So we're going to pick up now, remember, chapter 18, and we're looking at verse 2 now. So, in verse 2, the explanation here says that Bildad is rebuking his friends for shortening their speeches to allow Job to rebut them. He says that they should speak one after another and not allow Job to interrupt. So here we have Job now, who's being treated like a child, sit in the corner and speak when spoken to. You don't interrupt the adults. So it goes on now, and there's some Ramban, Ramban, he continues and says, first let us understand that Job is saying, what Job is saying, and then each of us should explain one after the other why there is no substance in Job's words, without waiting to hear further claims from him. Now, an alternate explanation for this is that Bildad is talking to Job, even though he is speaking in the plural. Why do you immediately respond to what we tell you without pausing to assimilate our words? Bildad's first speech also starts with a similar rhetorical question. So let's look at verse 3 now, where it says, why are we considered as a beast and obtuse in your eyes? Now, Bildad addresses his colleagues, demanding that they not allow Job to cut them short. In other words, don't let him interrupt or butt in on our conversation, because it's treating us as if we're fools. They should all have their say and not let him interrupt. So, Job is now the naughty boy in the corner, isn't he? Verse 4 goes on to explain that addressing Job, Bildad asks sarcastically whether he expects God, the rock, and the word to change as a consequence of his complaints, meaning, if Job complains, is God, the rock, going to change everything? Anger and annoyance cause harm to a person's spiritual caliber. If he is wise, he will lose his wisdom. Therefore, he should lovingly accept setbacks, pain, and insults. That if God causes his serenity to be disturbed, it is because God loves him and wants to bring him atonement for his sins. So one should pray to become humble. Verse 5 explanation goes on that light is a metaphor for success, and the success of the wicked will flicker out, and therefore they're left in the darkness. Verse 6, an explanation says that divine providence will remove any light from the abode of the wicked. Now, we come down now to verse 7. And in verse 7, the explanation is His confident steps striving to implement his schemes will come to nothing, as he is constrained by the confounding of his plans. His very scheme will prove to be his nemesis. Now, the sages go on and explain that, infer that verses 6 and 7, verses 6 and 7, that Job's wife died at this point. The world is darkened to any man whose wife dies in his lifetime. The proof text is verse 6, where Rab Yossi Bar Kanina says his steps become shortened. This is derived from verse 7. His advice fails him, also derived from verse 7. So there you go. Now we're going to jump now to verse 11. And verse 11 starts by saying, demons terrify him on all sides. They will beat him to the ground under his feet. Now, the explanation here continues and says, once the wicked person's punishment begins, he is surrounded by terrifying demons on all sides, who trap him and from whom there is no escape. Now, Ezra explains more literally that his strength shall go hungry and calamity awaits at his side. So just bear in mind, there's explanations that are general, and then there's some differing opinions, or not necessarily even differing opinions, but an alternative explanation as well. So, yeah, as with all biblical verses, there's always got to be some clarification or maybe another opinion as to the actual meaning, or it could even be a difference in how a word is presented. So we'll go down now to verse 13, and that means his branches is referring to his children. And the Prince of Death, you probably realise that that's the angel of death. No one can hide from that entity. So in verse 14, it begins, he will be torn from his wife who had depended on him. The translation follows Rashi's. Malbim explains the phrase as referring to the soul which a person hopes will survive him after death. It now leaves his body where it had previously dwelled. And the next phrase, it was still in verse 14. She will march off to the king of demons. Now his wife or his soul will lead him to the grave, to the king of the demons. This is similar to Bildad's first speech, where he declares about an evil person that his home, his wealth and his family and his children will be shown to be no more sturdy than a spider web. So, Job's still undergoing the onslaught of his friends. The second round of speech has not started well either, has it? Now, verse 16, this refers to his death and the destruction of his children. Verse 15, commencing, his memory will be lost. After his death and with no children to remember him, his memory will be lost. Oh. Now we're going down to verse 20. The historians studying Job's period will be astonished that his downfall was so complete. Do you know, I wonder when these words were written, did they realise that so many years later in 2021 there'd be a group of Noahides studying these words and fathoming out the wisdom and the knowledge that's contained in the book of Job? It's a nice thought, isn't it? I think so anyway. And the earlier generalisations will be seized by turmoil. Job's contemporaries who saw him at the height of his success will be confounded at his destruction. Verse 21 goes on, and the explanation is, to a righteous person such a fate would never happen, but it would befall the dwelling place of people who do not know God. So we're going into chapter 19 now. Now, in chapter 19, this is Job's response to Bildad, and this is Job's sixth speech. And one can only imagine how he must be feeling. He's probably thinking, is anything I'm saying getting into their thick skulls? Is anyone really listening to me? You can imagine the confusion and the frustration and the anxiety just to try and get through to his friends and have them be supportive of him, not to mention the terrible sorrow he's having with the loss of his children and his livelihood, but also this man is in extreme suffering. He has these stinky, rotten boils all over. We have to agree, Job is not in a very favourable place at the moment, and he's certainly not getting the comfort or the desired, intercession from his friends. So it goes on. In this response, Job does not add anything new. Rather, he expounds on his pain and suffering. He reiterates his conviction that they are unjust and undeserved. In conclusion, he tells his friends that they will be punished for their failure to weep with him and for their lack of empathy, for the magnitude and uniqueness of his afflictions. And it goes on in verse 2. Now, Bildad, like the other two friends, asserted that Job is an evil person, and therefore he has been punished. Their accusations sadden Job and add to his crushing pain. Of course it would. Verse 3 says, the friends made 5 speeches, and Job responded to them 5 times. The friends' rejection of Job's arguments is in itself a humiliation. Now, Rambam argues that it is not meant to be a precise count, but rather a figure of speech meaning many times. So either way, yes, many times the friends are saying basically the same thing, and many times Job is responding in, I didn't do anything wrong. Now, let's look at verse 4 that says, even if I have erred, my error lodges within me. And the explanation says, even if I have sinned, as you claim, I, not you, am suffering. So why do you humiliate me? Alternatively, it may mean, perhaps I sinned inadvertently, but even if I did, the awareness of the sin is within me. You cannot know my inner secrets, so why do you attack me? Down to verse 7 now, and Job, the explanation says that Job compares his situation to someone attacked on the road by robbers. He calls out to his fellow travellers, but no one pays attention. Then he brings his case to the courts and does not receive justice. So in other words, in my way, and he's been set in darkness, and the metaphor, Malcolm continues, the metaphor of a traveller is used, although I hope to seek justice from the Supreme Court of the land, God has barricaded the highway. Going down to verse 12 now, and that starts, together his legions advance. They pave their way toward me and encamp around my tent. Now, Job utilises the metaphor of a battle to describe the affliction God is sending against him. In other words, they've besieged him. No, they're besieging me. Now we move on over, and we're going to look at verse 17. Now, and it says, my breath is repulsive to my wife. I must ingratiate myself to my offspring. So the explanation is such. Job's disease made even his wife and offspring avoid him. Now look, they would be. And the nurse in me is saying this, not only would it be unpleasant to be around, granted, but also they may have had some concept of, if we touch him or go near him, do anything, we might catch something. We'll never really know sometimes what's in people's minds when they say something or when they don't do something. And so, it may not, Job might have said, no, don't come near me, don't touch me, or don't touch me. We weren't there. So that's why we rely on the explanations. And also it is meant to make us think. What may have happened, what could have happened, put myself in Job's shoes. Job's disease made even his wife and offspring avoid him. Although his children were dead, as we learnt in the very beginning of Job, he refers here to his grandchildren. So his children's children. Rashi suggests that the reference could be to foster children who he has raised. And Job, being such a good and righteous person, may well have done that as well. And he would be naturally calling them my children. Verse 19, let's look at that. It says, all my confidants detest me. Those I loved have turned against me. Now, Job's 3 friends now despise him. Even his closest friend Bildad, now remember that, Bildad was probably the closest out of the 3 friends to him. Bildad, whom he loved, the only one in the first round of speeches not to actually accuse him explicitly of being a sinner. But he now accuses him like the others. So this would be a double blow to Job, wouldn't it? The one out of the 3 friends that he possibly put the most trust and faith in is now joining with the other 2 in accusing him. Now we get to verse 20, and the verse says, I have escaped with the skin of my teeth. Now this is an interesting phrase. How often have we said something, I got out of that by the skin of my teeth? You have a close shave, you have a near accident or something like that. By the skin of my teeth. It's a very old phrase. Well, now here's the interesting explanation for that. And this will surprise you. I have escaped with the skin of my teeth. Job's gums were the only area of skin that were not afflicted with boils and maggots. I'll just read that again. Job's gums were the only areas of skin that were not afflicted with boils and maggots. Hence, the skin of my teeth. Fascinating, isn't it? If you ever use that expression again, you will always feel like you have to tell people the origin of that story, of that expression. Verse 21, the explanation is that Job makes one more plea to his friends who were once with him in their knowledge and wisdom. Verse 22 goes on, Job asks his friends, why do you torment me with your sharp words without justification? Just as God afflicts my body, aren't my physical pains enough? Why do you torment my soul as well? So we're back on this, it's not just his physical suffering and the loss of his children and the loss of his livelihood and stock, etc. But, this man's faith, this spirit, his intellect must be sorely abrased at the moment. It must just be too much. Let's go on now and we'll look at verse 24 explanation. And the verse begins, with an iron stylus and lead engraved forever on a rock. Now this is interesting, so I'm going to read this. Engravers would carve words into rock with an iron tool, then fill the carvings with molten lead. The stylus would not be made of lead, for it is too soft, so relative to the rock, in relation to the rock. In this way, Job's message would be preserved until the last generation, which will be able to discern with whom justice lies. Job claims that his friends caused him great harm in saying that his suffering was due to a lack of effort in understanding God. Interesting. Verse 25, explanation. Job refutes their claim that he has insufficient knowledge of God. He knows very well that God is the true and eternal Redeemer of his soul. When all else has been destroyed, only he will continue to exist. Verse 26 goes on, an explanation. Job accuses his friends of mercifully tormenting him with their harsh words of reproof, despite the obvious suffering he's experiencing as a result of his skin inflammations. Job is telling his friends that there is even more to his affliction than they see on the surface. When he sees the total destruction of his body while his life continues, he understands God's power over creation. Verse 27, my kidneys have been destroyed within me. As Rambam explained in the previous verse, no one else can know the depth and intensity of his affliction. Only Job knows that he no longer has kidneys, which makes his continued survival miraculous. Only the hand of God could keep him alive. Remember, we talked about this earlier, in earlier chapters, earlier verses. So, he's got organ failure as well. Zoe hasn't got enough going on, poor Job. So we go into verse 28 and it says, perhaps you should say, why do we beleaguer him? What is the root of the matter within him? Now the explanation says, why don't you show me sympathy? Why don't you wonder what underlying cause could have made me deserve such suffering? Verse 29 goes on and the explanation says, Job warns his friends that their sinful speech will surely incur God's wrath and lead to their destruction. They will then know that there is punishment in the world. Now we go to chapter 20, and here's the second friend of Job's. This is Zophar, Zophar. Now this is Zophar's second speech. So let's see what gems he has to offer. Zophar does not bring up new ideas, nor does he respond positively to Job's pleading in his last speech. Zophar expresses starkly the destruction of the wicked and their children, implying that Job is wicked. We come into verse 2 now, and there's further explanations. It says, Zophar means that he must respond to Job's words. Were he to remain silent, the ideas would force their way out of him. Alternately, the explanation says, as sensual perception, once Zophar perceived with his senses of sight and hearing that Job's speech was improper, his thoughts forced him to respond. Now, also, there's a notation here that Zophar's response is not directed to Job, whom he considers an apostate with whom there is no purpose in debating. Rather, Job's words made an impression on Zophar that require him to refute them to himself. So now Job's an apostate. Verse 4, Rambam explains, can you assert that the phenomena of God corrupting justice, punishing the righteous or rewarding the wicked, occurred in any of the generations from long ago? Now, we jump down to verse 7 now. Verse 7 starts, he will perish forever like his own dung, Those who had seen him will ask, where is he? Because there will be nothing left from which to remember him. The explanation continues. Rambam renders that as when he turns around, i.e. when he pauses in his rise to the clouds to evaluate his position, he is lost forever. He will realise that his antecedency will be ephemeral. I beg your pardon. Now, it goes on further. Let's turn the page here. So, are you getting frustrated with his friends? I am. Let's look at verse 10 now. And there's an explanation here. Now, the verse says, his children must appease the poor and his hands must make restitution for his robbery. So, ultimately, the explanation is, ultimately his ill-gotten wealth will be returned to the rightful owners. Whether his children will return what he stole or whether he himself will do so. Well, his children, first generation children, maybe his grandchildren might do it. For he will lose the power that enabled him to amass his fortune, and the courts will force him to return what he took. Now, verse 11 goes on and says, the power that he attained through the sins of his youth will be buried with him, since he did not repent before he died and was buried in the dirt. Okay. Verse 12, explanation. According to Rambam, the purpose of hiding it when it is not the appropriate time is so that no one can take revenge against him. Verse 14, an explanation says that his punishment will be that his food will reverse itself. So in other words, it'll taste like as bitter as snake venom, really nasty, and that will force him to vomit it out. In other words, the food went in, but it's going to come back out again. Verse 17 says, he will not see the streams, the rivers, the brooks of honey and cream. Now, this is a metaphor for the pleasures of paradise. Verse 18, the response, the comment is that the wicked one will be forced to return what he stole from other people's work. Even if he has already put it in his mouth, so to speak, he will not be able to swallow it. It goes on and says, as great as his dishonestly acquired wealth, so great will be the poverty that will come in its stead. He will not rejoice again, for he will not return to his former state of prosperity. Now, verse 19 goes on, and the explanation says that the house he stole from, it says here, because he smashed the poor and laid them waste, he has stolen a house, but he did not build it. Now, the Rambam says that because he oppressed the poor until he left them broken, the house he stole from them will not be built, since it will be taken away from him. The Rashi renders, when he smashed the poor, he will leave them, for he will be taken from the world, when the poor will retrieve what he stole. So, let's go over now to verse 21. Now, the explanation is, Rashi explains he took everything for himself and never shared his wealth with the poor. This was the behaviour of Sodom, the wicked city, that was notorious for its cruel selfishness, and they certainly didn't practice charity. That was a big sin. However, the sages understand the sin as not supporting Torah scholars. It's another important thing to do as well. The sages derive homiletically that if someone does not leave even a small piece of bread on his table, he will not enjoy prosperity. Greed does not beget success. What a fascinating example. Verse 22, explanation. Once he reaches the pinnacle of wealth, he will fall as if from heaven to earth and will be so weak that even the weary will be able to steal from him. The sages derive that God chose not to bring intense suffering until the measure of sin is full. Verse 23, Ramban renders, when the wicked one attempts to fill his stomach with delicacies, God will send his anger against his food. Interesting when we get heartburn, or you get sort of regurgitation, you get that awful hot feel. I wonder, I'm never going to think of heartburn in quite the same way. Perhaps that's, the food's angry. Or the body's angry with the food, maybe. I'll leave that discussion to people much, much more intelligent and scholarly than I am. Now, we're going to go up to verse 26 now, and an explanation here I'll just read. Targum and Rashi render the unfanned fire as the fire of Ganom, in other words, hell. Rashi explains that the wicked here are the people of Sodom, and he identifies the unfortunate survivor with Lot, whose wife perished. That's interesting, isn't it? Verse 27, Rashi translates here that God is patient and often does not punish until the sinner's quota of sin is filled. Onlookers may not even be aware of the extent of their sins. But when the heavenly punishment makes plain that their sin is no longer tolerated, then his fellow humans will also reject him. Now, Rambam renders, the land will despise you and you will bring forth thorns and thistles. Verse 29 goes on. Now, Matsuda summarizes Zophar's speech. The proof of divine providence is severe, unrelenting punishment of the wicked, including those who question God's righteousness and deny the justice of his actions. It is as if Zophar declares to Job, this is your sin and this is your outcome. So that brings us to the conclusion of chapter 20. We're going to go on to chapter 21 now. This is the last chapter in this video. So now Job responds to Zophar. Okay, Job's seventh speech. This is now, and I'll read an introduction to that. Then Job spoke up and said, in the previous speech, Zophar describes starkly the destruction of the wicked and their children. Here Job disputes what he sees as a simplistic assertion not born out of reality. Job's friends have a ready answer to explain the suffering of the righteous and the success of the wicked. They assert to Job, if you were punished severely, you must be among the wicked and must not be righteous. As for the successful wicked one, his future generations will be cut off. Job mocks those answers. What is the point of punishing the wicked by afflicting their offspring hundreds of years from now? He's making a good point. That neither troubles them nor causes them pain. Nor does the friend's answer to the suffering of the righteous satisfy the test of reason. Their only answer is that Job is in fact a sinner and he deserves punishment. Job rejects this view categorically, maintaining his total innocence, and so it continues. In verse 2, friends have said nothing that consoles Job, but he declares that he will feel as if consoled if his friends would just be silent and listen to him. Now, I wish they'd be silent too. Can you imagine? Wouldn't you just want to say, look, shut up. Just listen to me. Let me moan my agony. Be quiet. Be quiet. And in verse 3, Job says, "Permit me to speak my fill, then so far you may laugh if you wish." So he's sort of saying, let me say what I need to say. In verse 4, "It is not to man but to God that I complain. Therefore I have the right to expect a fair hearing." Now in verse 5, Rambam suggests that it is Job himself who is dumbstruck when he contemplates the injustice of the successful wicked, as he says in the following verses. And Job is shocked at the extent of his suffering. Now, alternately, I recall what happened to the wicked people of the generation of the flood of Noah's time. They were wiped out. They should be. Why should the wicked prosper in our time? Such unadulterated success was seen in the generation of the flood, in Noah's time, but it did not endure. Only God could have granted such prosperity to sinners until he wiped them from the face of the earth. Why do today's sinners enjoy uninterrupted success? Question a lot of us often ask. Let's look at the explanation of verse 8 now. It goes on and says that during their lifetime, they see their children and grandchildren living together happy in harmony, in contrast to Eliphaz's description of the life of the wicked. Verses 9 to 12, Job gives a lyrical description of the unrelieved blessings enjoyed by the wicked, who, according to the friends, should have been battered with unrelieved suffering. Not only are their children happy and carefree, even their livestock never suffer any mishaps. Now, in verse 13, what disturbs Job is that these wicked people have a good life and a painless death, even though they rebel against or deny God. Let's go up to verse 14. Now, the explanation says that people insist there is no benefit in serving God. In verse 15, the explanation continues. What benefit will we gain if we follow his laws and ask for his intercession? We don't even need him for a drop of rain. For there is a water cycle in nature, as the Torah stated in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. Might want to refer to that. A mist descended from the earth and watered the whole surface of the soil. Job is quoting the wicked as saying their world is governed by nature, not by God. Explanation goes on. Wicked people have no need to pray because they already have health and wealth, and their children are well provided for. Verse 16. The explanation says, since I do not let myself be swayed by the good fortune of the wicked, why do I suffer so? If the wicked prosper, though they do not deserve it, I should surely succeed and be spared from suffering. Now, down in verse 17, Mitzudos interprets how many, as Job asserts, I have seen so many of the wicked who live the good life in tranquility, but how many, only a few, suffer from afflictions and find their schemes to be foiled. Job is coming to believe that the success of the wicked was irrevocably ordained, but he is wrong. Decrees for good or bad are made in response to each individual. So true. Verse 18 goes on with an explanation that Job counters Zophar's assertion that the punishment of the wicked proves divine providence. Job refutes that assertion. He points to the small number who are punished, as he previously mentioned. Now in verse 19, explanation here and in the next two verses, Job asks this question. What is the reason for determining the punishment of the wicked? Is it fair for the wicked to be punished through the suffering of their children? Yet the sinners themselves experience the suffering they deserve. I beg your pardon. Let the sinners themselves experience the suffering they deserve. In verse 21, the explanation follows. He will have lived his given months before his children are punished. Not only will he not suffer, he will not even see the suffering that he caused. Rambam interprets here that the wicked one will neither worry about the suffering of his children nor rejoice in their happiness, because he will die because he will die before anything happens to them. Verse 22 says, "Can one teach knowledge to God? He who judges the lofty." Now Job asks, could a human being like him teach God how to judge people? Is he not the judge of the entire world? Could it be that he does not judge fairly? But that is exactly what Job thinks at the moment, and what he's inferring. Alternatively, could anyone seek to understand God's judgment, which is so sublime, so far beyond man's understanding? Now, this is something important too, that when we say, oh, why did that happen to him? Or, things, just bear in mind, there are things we're not privy to. We do not understand the workings of God. And so to look for an answer sometimes is rather presumptuous, isn't it? I mean, when it involves ourselves, we might be thinking, oh, maybe I didn't do this right, maybe, examining our own conscience. But it's not for us to decide the fors and against of another person. That's God's domain, remains God's. That person is God's property and God's responsibility. I just want to read now in verses 23 to 26. The explanations here are, as examples, Job cites two people whose lives and deaths reflect polar opposites. One lived a blessed life and died peacefully and serenely, while the other lived a life of pain and suffering, never tasting of the good. Finally, they both lie in the grave, equally covered with maggots. According to Rashi in the Malbim, Job claims that the one who lived blissfully was wicked. The one who was subjected to harsh and painful life, like Job is, was righteous. Methuselah says that Job claims both were equally evil. According to the Friends, the different ways the two lived and died cannot be explained rationally. So too says Job. The Friends' efforts to explain his suffering fail totally. Moving along to verse 24, there's an explanation here that says that there's a sense of ability to provide for one's family. It says about the marrow of the bones being moist, the breasts full of milk. So it's an illusion, that you have an ability to provide optimally for your nourishment of your children. Let's look at verse 27 now and an explanation. This says, "For you to derive from my afflictions that I am evil is tantamount to a violent attack against me." 28. "The generous one is Job. The loss of his home and property is proof that he is no different from any other wicked person." Now, verse 29. I'll read the verse. Verse says, "Did you not inquire of wayfarers? Do not ignore their testimonies." Now, the explanation, "Since you came from afar, you must have inquired about me on the way." This is Job saying to his friends. "Since you came from afar, you must have inquired about me on the way. Did you not hear stories of my generosity and righteousness? Do not deny them now by insisting that I am wicked." Now, let's just cast your mind back. We're talking about not like they jumped on a train. These men would have likely walked. I don't know. They may have had a donkey or something to carry their luggage, so to speak. They didn't know how long they were going to be with Job. But, they would stop to water their donkey, water themselves, to rest, to feed, eat. People in those days talked. There wasn't a newspaper. Where are you coming from? Oh, such and such. Where are you off to? Well, we're off to see our friend who's ill. He's had a, great tragedy, lost his children. Oh, who would that be? Oh, that would be Job. Job. Job from such a... Oh, yes, he's a nice man. Do you understand what I'm getting at? The bush telegraph, as we call it in Australia, the talk, in these small villages that they may have passed through, there may well have been people who knew Job well, who may well have been beneficiary of his kindness at some stage. So this is what Job's saying. Since you came from afar, you must have inquired about me on the way. Hey? Have you heard about Job? Have you heard how he is? Did you not hear stories of my generosity and righteousness? Do not deny them now by insisting that I am wicked. So Job's confident and knows that, that he's got a good reputation. Verse 30, only God's final judgment when the evil one leaves this world will decide his fate in the world to come. Verse 31 explanation goes on, the wicked one has been successful in most of his endeavours. Who can call him to task for his evil ways? He will laugh at them and their threats of punishment. Verse 32 explanation goes on and says, Job asserts that one cannot determine a person's level of righteousness or evil by observing his success or failure in this life, and not even at his funeral or burial. He will face his true punishment only when he passes to the next world. And verse 33, this is the last explanation. Many men preceded him to the grave, and many will follow. But about none of them can you say that the presence or absence of affliction from their lives indicates their righteousness or lack of it. This is Job's question on the principle of reward and punishment. And we will leave it there. That is the end of verse 21. So we're still back with the same theme. The friends aren't really doing what friends should be doing, and yet they've got points. They've got a point. They're right in some ways, but and then Job's saying, look, you know me, you know who I am. Surely people around the district know who I am, that I'm a good person. And so this dilemma goes on, and poor Job, in the meantime, Job's still mourning the loss of his family, and he has to contend with these dreadful, dreadful boils that are oozing, etc., and very painful. Thank you for being with me throughout this video. Thank you, all of those of you who are subscribers. If you're not already a subscriber, I suggest that you do, because I do put videos up at different times, occasionally, not always at a routine time. And I hope you have enjoyed following along on the book of Job so far. I really enjoy presenting it for you. I hope it's helpful. In the meantime, please take care and God bless.